The year is 1901. A class portrait is taken at the Ashford Academy, a highly respected institution in the heart of industrial Boston. The photograph shows 32 students arranged in neat rows, their faces solemn beneath the photographer's black cloth. This photo seems unremarkable at first glance, just another annual ritual documented for posterity. Yet decades later, a specific detail about one student, Oakley Harrison, would raise a question that challenges the very nature of archival evidence and official records. A single name in a registry would spark a controversy that forces historians to reconsider what they thought they knew about institutional memory and truth. This is not a ghost story, though it might sound like one. This is the account of how a single 1901 class photo from the Ashford Academy became a major historical puzzle when a researcher discovered a student in the image had officially died in 1900. The question is not who the boy was, but how a child could be present in a mandatory group photo a full year after his known and documented death. This is the curiosity that demands examination, the kind of historical anomaly that refuses a simple explanation. The Ashford Academy was prestigious in its time, requiring absolute attendance for its annual portrait. The institution prided itself on meticulous record-keeping and strict administrative procedures. Every student was required to appear in the photograph or provide documented evidence of illness or family emergency. The photo was not merely a keepsake for proud parents. It was a mandated administrative record, stored carefully in the Boston Municipal Archive, part of the official documentation that proved enrollment numbers to city authorities and private benefactors. The Academy depended on these records for its funding and reputation. In 1985, Daxton Wells began a project to digitize the school's historical collection. Daxton worked as the senior archivist at the Boston Municipal Archive, responsible for preserving and cataloging thousands of documents from closed or defunct educational institutions. The Ashford Academy had closed its doors in 1954, and its complete records had been transferred to the archive. Daxton approached the work with professional detachment, expecting routine cataloging of attendance logs, financial records, and annual photographs. The 1901 class photo was one of hundreds requiring processing and preservation. Daxton cross-referenced the names in the photo registry with available municipal death records as part of standard archival protocol. This process helped identify students and track institutional history across decades. Most entries matched perfectly, showing students who graduated, moved away, or died much later in life. But one name stopped Daxton cold during the verification process. The name Oakley Harrison appeared clearly in the photo registry for 1901, listed among the students present for the annual portrait. Yet the death certificate, located in the Boston City Mortality Index, was dated October 14, 1900. The cause of death was listed as scarlet fever. The attending physician was Dr. M.L. Sanderson. The burial location was confirmed at Mount Hope Cemetery. This gap of an entire year between death and photographic appearance became the key problem that would not resolve itself with simple explanation. Daxton initially dismissed the anomaly as a clerical error. Such mistakes were common in the early 20th century when records were handwritten and cross-referencing between institutions was difficult. Names could be misspelled, dates transposed, or entries duplicated across multiple ledgers. The most logical explanation seemed to be that either the death date was wrong or the photo registry contained an error. However, the official school records at Ashford Academy were exceptionally meticulous. The Academy employed a full-time registrar whose sole responsibility was maintaining accurate enrollment documentation. The photo registry was not a draft or preliminary list. It was the final signed document, certified by both the headmaster and the school photographer. Each student's name appeared in careful copperplate handwriting beside their position number in the photograph. Tadeo Morgan, a forensic historian specializing in photographic evidence and institutional records, was brought in to examine the case. Taddeo had built a reputation for solving historical mysteries through careful analysis of physical evidence and documentary sources. The Ashford Academy case intrigued Taddeo precisely because it seemed so impossible on the surface. Taddeo began by examining the physical photograph itself, looking for signs of manipulation or alteration. The image showed no evidence of tampering. The photographic plate was original. The chemical composition consistent with 1901 processing methods. The building visible in the background had undergone specific architectural modifications in late 1900, changes that were documented in construction permits and visible in the photograph. This confirmed the 1901 date beyond reasonable doubt. Taddeo then turned attention to the death records. The Boston City Mortality Index maintained duplicate records in 2 separate locations as standard practice. Both copies listed Oakley Harrison's death as October 14, 1900. The attending physician's signature matched other documents signed by Dr. Sanderson. The burial permit was filed with Mount Hope Cemetery, and the grave plot was registered and maintained. There was no ambiguity in the death records. Oakley Harrison had died in 1900, nearly a full year before the photograph was taken. 3 main theories emerged to explain the impossible situation. The first theory suggested an impostor, that a different child, perhaps a relative, stood in for Oakley Harrison to preserve his enrollment status or for some social reason. This would explain the photographic presence while accepting the death date as accurate. The second theory proposed a date error, arguing that the photograph itself was misdated and actually taken in 1900 before Oakley's death. Taddeo dismissed this quickly based on the architectural evidence and the signed registry document. The third theory involved a duplicated record, suggesting that an administrative error caused the 1900 student to be mistakenly included in the 1901 registry through careless copying from previous year's documents. Each theory had problems. The imposter theory required explaining why school officials would allow such a deception. The date error theory contradicted physical evidence. The duplicated record theory failed to account for the meticulous nature of Ashford Academy's documentation process. Taddeo felt certain that something more deliberate had occurred, something that went beyond simple clerical mistakes or family sentiment. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While reviewing the Academy's annual administrative reports, Taddeo discovered that the 1901 report, prepared and signed by Headmaster Sage Whitmore, mentioned Oakley Harrison by name as an enrolled and attending student in the spring term of 1901. This was months after the documented death date. The report listed Oakley among students who had achieved perfect attendance in mathematics instruction. The document was not a copied registry or duplicated enrollment list. It was a narrative report written specifically about the 1901 academic year. Sage Whitmore had personally written Oakley Harrison's name in a context that suggested active participation in classes during 1901. This discovery shifted the investigation from accident to intention. Someone at the Ashford Academy knew about the discrepancy and chose to maintain the fiction of Oakley's continued enrollment. The question became why an institution would engage in such obvious fraud, risking its reputation and legal standing. Taddeo began investigating the Academy's financial situation during the 1900 to 1901 academic year, looking for pressure points that might motivate desperate action. The Ashford Academy was under severe financial pressure from its Board of Trustees during this period. The institution had expanded rapidly in the 1890s, adding new buildings and hiring additional faculty based on projected enrollment growth. But a regional economic downturn had reduced the number of families who could afford private education. The Academy's primary funding came from a combination of tuition fees and grants from the Pemberton Education Foundation, a private trust that supported Boston area schools. The Pemberton grants were tied directly to enrollment numbers. Schools had to maintain specific student counts to qualify for funding tiers. A decrease in enrollment could mean the loss of thousands of dollars in essential operating support. Taddeo discovered correspondence between Sage Whitmore and the Pemberton Foundation dated February 1901. In this letter, Sage certified that Ashford Academy maintained full enrollment of 32 students, meeting the threshold for maximum grant funding. The letter was accompanied by supporting documentation including the 1901 class photograph. The photograph served as visual proof of enrollment, a way to demonstrate that the Academy had not lost students to competing institutions or economic pressures. If the photograph showed only 31 students, questions would arise about the missing student. The grant might be reduced or delayed pending investigation. A student death, especially a midterm death, created specific problems for enrollment-based funding. Parents who paid tuition in advance for a full year might request partial refunds. Grant-giving organizations might recalculate funding based on actual attendance rather than projected enrollment. Competing schools might use the death as evidence of health problems or inadequate care at the academy. For an institution already struggling financially, the death of Oakley Harrison represented not just personal tragedy, but institutional crisis. Taddeo found the smoking gun in a private memorandum dated January 1901, filed among Sage Whitmore's personal correspondence. The memo was addressed to Apollo Chen, the Academy's administrative secretary and registrar. The memo used carefully coded language, but its meaning was clear to anyone familiar with institutional correspondence. Sage instructed Apollo to maintain the current roll for the annual census, regardless of disposition. The phrase, regardless of disposition, was particularly telling. In institutional language of the era, disposition referred to status changes including graduation, expulsion, or death. Sage was explicitly instructing Apollo to ignore Oakley Harrison's death when preparing official documentation. The memo continued with specific instructions about the annual photograph. Sage noted that the photograph must reflect the full complement of enrolled students to satisfy external requirements. The language suggested that Sage viewed this not as deception, but as administrative necessity, a technical solution to a bureaucratic problem. The tone was businesslike and matter-of-fact, treating the falsification of records as simply another task on the administrative calendar. But how could a dead child appear in a photograph? The answer required finding additional documentation about the specific day the photograph was taken. Taddeo located the photographer's invoice in the Academy's financial records. The invoice listed the date as March 12, 1901, and included an unusual notation about a delayed start time due to missing students. The photographer had been asked to wait while school officials located certain children who were not in their proper places when the session was scheduled to begin. Cross-referencing this date with other documents, Taddeo found a visitor log that recorded the presence of Winter Harrison, Oakley's younger brother, at the Academy on March 12th. Winter was not a student at Ashford Academy. He attended a different school in Boston, yet the visitor log showed he arrived at the Academy in mid-morning on the exact day of the photograph, accompanied by Apollo Chen. The log noted that Winter was present for approximately 1 hour before departing with Apollo. The picture became clear through additional evidence. Taddeo located a brief note in Apollo Chen's desk journal, a personal record not intended as official documentation. The entry for March 12th mentioned collecting the younger Harrison boy from his home and returning him after the photography session. The note included practical details about the difficulty of finding clothing that fit properly and the boy's nervousness during the process. Apollo wrote that the boy had been instructed to stand perfectly still and say nothing during the photograph, to simply maintain position until the photographer completed the exposure. The student in the 1901 photograph was not Oakley Harrison. It was Winter Harrison, Oakley's younger brother, dressed in Oakley's school uniform and positioned among students he had never met, told to stand motionless while the photographer captured the image that would serve as proof of enrollment to the Pemberton Education Foundation. This was the simple, desperate human action behind the historical anomaly. a 9-year-old boy standing in for his dead brother so that a struggling institution could maintain its funding and continue operating. Further investigation revealed the scope of the conspiracy. Mira Sutton, a senior teacher at the academy, had opposed the plan in a letter to Sage Whitmore. Mira argued that using Winter Harrison in the photograph constituted fraud and endangered the academy's reputation. Sage responded in writing that the alternative was immediate closure of the academy and loss of employment for all faculty. Sage framed the decision as choosing between technical dishonesty and practical disaster. Most faculty members, dependent on their academy salaries and lacking other employment options, chose to remain silent about what they knew. The Harrison family's role in the deception remained unclear until Tadeo located correspondence between Sage and Peyton Harrison, Oakley and Winter's father. Peyton had initially refused to allow Winter's participation, calling the scheme disrespectful to Oakley's memory. Sage responded with a combination of financial pressure and emotional appeal. The academy owed the Harrison family a partial tuition refund for Oakley's interrupted enrollment. Sage offered to forgive this debt if Peyton would allow Winter to appear in the photograph. Sage also suggested that cooperation would ensure favorable consideration if the Harrison family wished to enroll Winter at Ashford Academy in the future at reduced tuition rates. Faced with immediate financial need and vague promises of future benefit, Peyton Harrison agreed to the arrangement. The conspiracy worked. The Pemberton Education Foundation approved the Academy's grant application for 1901 based on the certified enrollment numbers and supporting photograph. The Academy survived its financial crisis and continued operating for another 5 decades. Oakley Harrison remained listed in official records as a student in good standing for the 1900 and 1901 academic year. The true story remained hidden until Daxton Wells began systematic cross-referencing of archival materials nearly a century later. The entire historical mystery was not supernatural or a failure of the archive. It was a testament to the lengths institutions would go to survive financial pressure. The ghost in the photograph was the ghost of administrative desperation, the shadow of an institution choosing fraud over closure. What appears at first glance as an impossible paradox resolves into a very human story of economic pressure, moral compromise, and the willingness of ordinary people to bend rules when faced with survival threats. The discovery had implications beyond the Ashford Academy case. Tadeo's investigation prompted broader questions about the reliability of institutional photographs as historical evidence. How many other enrollment photographs from the era contained similar deceptions? How often did struggling institutions manipulate their records to maintain funding or reputation? The Ashford Academy was not particularly corrupt or unusual. It was simply an institution responding to the pressures of its time using the tools available. Modern archivists now approach historical photographs with greater skepticism, understanding that images presented as objective documentation might contain deliberate distortions. The Ashford Academy photograph remains in the Boston Municipal Archive, properly labeled now to indicate that one student in the image is Winter Harrison, standing in for his deceased brother Oakley. The photograph serves as a teaching tool for historians, demonstrating how financial pressures can shape even seemingly objective historical records. The class photo, once a simple record, now serves as a quiet, physical reminder of the pressure on small, ambitious institutions in the early 20th century. It represents the human cost of funding structures that tied institutional survival to enrollment numbers, forcing administrators to choose between honesty and continued operation. The photograph is no longer just an image of 32 students arranged in neat rows. It is a document of compromise, desperation, and the everyday moral calculations that shaped institutional behavior in an era of educational expansion and economic uncertainty. The story raises questions about how we interpret historical records and what assumptions we make about institutional honesty. When modern researchers encounter enrollment documents and supporting photographs, they typically assume accuracy unless given specific reasons for doubt. The Ashford Academy case suggests that assumption may need revision, particularly for institutions operating under financial stress. The photograph that seemed like transparent documentation turns out to be carefully constructed fraud, executed by otherwise honest people facing impossible choices. What do we owe to historical truth when survival requires deception? The administrators and faculty at Ashford Academy did not see themselves as criminals or frauds. They saw themselves as people trying to keep an educational institution alive during difficult times. Sage Whitmore likely justified the decision by focusing on the greater good of continued education for the 31 students who genuinely attended the academy. The cost was a falsified photograph and the uncomfortable use of a grieving child to perpetuate institutional fiction. The case demonstrates how institutional records, even those maintained with apparent care and professionalism, can contain deliberate distortions invisible to future researchers without careful cross-referencing and skeptical investigation. It shows how financial incentives shape behavior in ways that compromise documentary integrity. Most importantly, it reveals the human dimension behind historical anomalies, the real people making difficult choices under pressure, choosing survival over principle when those seem to be the only options available.